this episode of Digging In. This is a segment that helps us study a passage of the Bible, specifically a passage that we'll be looking at here at Sunnyslope within the next week or so. Psalm 4 is actually, it's a psalm that I've come to really appreciate because it deals with a very, I think, a very practical problem. It's one that many of us have dealt with at a time or two. And that is those nights when you just can't sleep. And it's, I don't know if you've ever had that. Most of us probably have, where you lie awake and then there's all those ideas and those thoughts that kind of run through your head and nag at you and bother you enough that you find it hard to fall back asleep, those different worries and concerns. And it might sound like a very trivial thing, but in fact, this psalm addresses that. And so we're going to be looking at it. I'm going to pull it up on the screen here. And of course, the first step that we take anytime we're going to do a Bible study of a passage, the first thing we want to do, of course, is to read the passage through. We're not really looking to do anything more than that at that point. We're just looking to read it, to become familiar with it, to see what stands out or what strikes us about it. And we save the more in-depth textual study for a couple steps later. Once we've read it through and we're familiar with it, the next thing that we want to do is kind of pull it apart. We want to lay out the different phrases and how they relate to each other so that we can get a good sense of the flow of thought and the ideas and how the ideas are developed. So I've put the words up on the screen. And I'm going to pull verse 1 down here like this because we have a little, in addition to the title, we also have what we call an ascription, which is to the choir master. We might pull this because it doesn't seem the choir master has stringed instruments, but means that the psalm has stringed instruments and it's a psalm of David. So to the choir master, how it's to be played and what it is. Real simple. So we'll put that up there. Now the actual text of the psalm. We start like this. And we begin, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. That's a simple phrase. It stands pretty nicely by itself. Then the next sentence. Now what we could do, we could raise the question, O God of my righteousness. We could maybe move this down here like that, because of my righteousness is modifying God. But for now, I'm actually going to leave it up here. I think that just works better as one phrase. So you have given me, because again, a phrase is defined largely by a verb, a single verb or verbal noun, a participle. You have given me relief when I was in distress. So maybe just to make it clear, we'll just put relief and distress opposite each other. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. That's looking a fair bit like Hebrew poetry. How could God be gracious? By hearing the prayer. Oh man, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? So here's a repeated question. How long shall my honor be turned into shame? Oops. And then a similar question again. How long will you love vain words? And then when we see the word and, that's a clue that it's a new phrase. So it's not just loving vain words, but it's also seeking after lies. And that actually, you can kind of see there is a little contrast there. Vain words and lies are kind of two sides of the same coin. So we're actually noticing here's the complaint that the psalmist raises. It's kind of like this part here is his request, now his complaint. And then he's going back to what does he know about God? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. So you see this actually quite a lot in the Psalms where the psalmist names his trouble and then he finds his way back to what the truth that he knows about God. So he's always answering those troubles and those worries in that way. The Lord hears when I call to him. And I think just for fun, I'm going to put these two phrases like this, to him and for himself. There's some parallel idea there. There's some similarity. Be angry. Well, that's a simple command. Whoops, I want that a little further up. I'm going to run out of room otherwise. Be angry and do not sin. Two commands there. Ponder in your own hearts. And because it's, on your own beds, you see the similarity between those two phrases. And be silent. That's kind of an interesting structure I'm noticing. Be angry, don't sin, ponder in your hearts on your beds, be silent. I don't know, maybe there's something more to that, but we're not there yet. Offer right sacrifices. Put your trust in the Lord. So it's giving a series of commands. Now, one of the questions we're asking is, who is he actually talking to? Um, I think I know the answer to that, but it's always a good question to ask. Who is the psalmist addressing? Who is he speaking to? Sometimes he's speaking to other people. Sometimes he's speaking to himself. Sometimes he's speaking to God. We should always be at least wondering about that. There are many who say, and then when we have a quotation, we always we indent that quotation so we can distinguish it. Who will show us some good? Now he's going to answer that question, it seems. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You've put more joy in my heart. And then the word more is a comparative, so then that fits nicely with the word than. More than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord. Let's go like this. I'm losing my words here. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So there's that idea again of sleeping. Find that twice. The beginning of the psalm where it talks about where was it? Up here, ponder in your own hearts and on your beds and be silent. So kind of two references there to the idea of what happens when you're lying in bed and you can't fall asleep. So we've really all we've done is we've just broken this down. We haven't done a whole lot more with it yet. We've kind of tried to identify some of the way that the flow of thought is going. And our next step is going to be to dig into the different words, the structure of the text. What does the structure teach us? And as we do that, that's how we come to learn the real meaning and the message of the text. So we'll pick it up there shortly. All right, we're back. We are looking here at Psalm 4. We're digging into Psalm 4. We've already laid out our text. We've taken the time to break it down into the smaller phrases and pieces so that we can kind of follow the order of thought and the logic. Now it's time to dig into the way to the real meat of the text. And I always kind of talk about this as playing in the sandbox. We get to kind of look around at the different words that are being used, what those words might mean, which words seem significant. We get to look at things like the parallelism and the symmetry of the language. And as we do all of that, we come to discover and appreciate what is the real message of the text. So let's get started. I'm going to put our text back up on the screen so that you'll be able to see it. And then we're just going to jump right in. So one of the things that I notice when I read through is that the psalm is broken into a number of different sections, and each section seems to be focused on addressing a different person. So, for example, if we start here, and I'm just going to use an up arrow because the psalmist is speaking about himself, but he is addressing God. He's addressing God in the third person, and so we see that with you and I, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Well, in all of this, he's talking to God. There's no real question there. He's not asking for his friends or his enemies to hear his prayer, obviously. And we know that that's confirmed because obviously here in verse 1, he's addressing God. Now, we go a little further in the text, and maybe just for to make this a little bit clear, we actually see that now the psalmist is speaking to somebody else. And we can use a horizontal arrow here. It's always, I think this is maybe just a good reminder that when you're looking at a text, especially, I don't know, I think it's especially in poetry we find it, but it's always a helpful clue to look at who is being addressed. And a lot of times throughout the psalm, you'll find that the psalmist is changing his audience, so to speak. So now he's talking, "O men." So we kind of see a contrast here. We'll just make a note of that. And he's asking them a number of questions. And then it seems he's not speaking to the Lord here, but he's addressing his enemies about the Lord, right? So and we know that that's confirmed here because he uses the third person singular pronoun for him and for himself. So now the psalmist is turning and he's speaking to people who seem to have it in for him for one reason or another. We're not exactly clear what that is. I noticed that there's a phrase that's repeated. I'm going to just highlight it because I think it's worth paying attention to. And that's the phrase, how long? So we're just going to highlight that. That shows up a couple of times. We find that phrase repeated actually throughout in a number of different psalms, and it occurs to me that this is a question, it's a pretty basic question that many of us ask, right? How long will I have to endure? How long will the suffering go on? Most of us, we can suffer if we know a time limit. If we know that, okay, next week, Tuesday at about noon, your suffering is going to end. Most of us can put up with it. We can sort of carry ourselves through and strengthen ourselves, knowing, okay, it's only 3 more days, it's only 2 more days. But the problem is that we don't get that. We don't get that time, that specific time limit that we often would like. And so we're left asking that question, how long? How long am I going to have to put up with this person who's making my life very difficult? Or how long am I going to have to deal with cancer treatments? Or how long am I going to have to um, keep fighting with my wife or whatever it might be? And so that question of how long is one that comes up over and over again. And I think it's an important and a good question that that reflects so much of the human experience. Okay, so we move on again, just continuing a little bit more with the language of the text. I want to erase that. I don't know why. There we go. I'm kind of a perfectionist that way. All right. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly to himself. So it seems that he's speaking here to his enemies who are mistreating him or who have it in for him, and he's speaking to them about the faithfulness and the commitment of God and God's care for his people. Now I notice, and I'm going to highlight this word here. We'll use the highlighter to draw some attention to this. The Lord hears, and that comes back here. So we kind of see there's kind of a connection here because what the psalmist is doing is when he's speaking to God, he's asking that God would hear his prayer. He's calling on God to, don't ignore me when I'm really in a bad place. But when he's speaking to his enemies, he's expressing confidence that God indeed will hear him when I call. So he's pleading with God to answer his prayer, but he's speaking to his enemies with the confidence that God will indeed answer. Now, um, we go a little bit further and we get these. There's a number of we're going to just they're kind of command verbs, and I'll just maybe I'll put them in kind of a red color. There's a number of command. We have offer right sacrifices. We have be silent, ponder, be angry, and do not sin. Those kind of go together. Um, so the question is, who is the psalmist speaking to? Well, it seems that he's speaking, at least for now, we're going to go with the theory that he's still speaking to those who have it in for him. He's addressing them and he's talking to them. We know that at least in part because there's, your own hearts, there's plural here, plural language. So it's not, he's not talking to himself, at least it doesn't seem that way here. It does in a little bit, um but he's speaking to people outside of himself, and he's telling them what to do. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly. Oh, and there's one more. Put your trust in the Lord. So he's calling them maybe to repentance. At least that's kind of what it seems. Ponder, reflect, be silent, offer sacrifices. So this all seems to be a sort of call to repentance. So maybe when we think of the enemies, at least this is a theory we can work with for now. We don't know enough to affirm or deny it yet, but it could be that his enemies are people who maybe should know better. Maybe they're people who they're people who should have lived in and maybe once did live in right relationship with God, maybe part of the covenant people, and yet they turned on David for whatever reason. And now what David is doing is he's calling them back to obedience, or he's calling them back to right relationship with God. I say that because you wouldn't necessarily expect an Israelite to be speaking to, outsiders about offering right sacrifices and putting your trust in the Lord, at least not quite in this same language. Now, maybe I'm wrong. We could, there's still room to kind of work on that theory and to either, confirm or deny it, but we can, for now, we're going to let that be our working theory. Um, Now we go a little bit further, and this is, I think, where it gets a little bit, this is where it gets just a little bit confusing. Or not confusing, but there's some changes that seem to be taking place. There are many who say, "Who will show us some good?" And then we're back to an address towards God, right? "O Lord," and then the "you." Lift up the light of your face. So it seems that the psalmist here, and maybe as far as to the end of the psalm, is speaking back to God. So he's acknowledging that there are people who are cynical about God. And again, maybe these are people within the covenant community who have grown cynical about God's favor. That happened. We know that happened in Israelite history. We know there were people who questioned God's provision, his providence, his care. So maybe that fits here. Who will show us some good, right? In other words, will any, is God going to continue to do good to us? Is God really going to care for us? And so what the psalmist is doing now is he's back to giving a command. So he's raising this question. There are many, the psalmist seems to be saying, maybe he's even saying it to God. There are many who say, "Who will show us some good?" And now what the psalmist is doing is he's giving a command, but he's giving it to God, right? And we will, maybe for consistency's sake, we'll circle the word Lord here. So we kind of see, again, there's this change in address. And actually, just for consistency, we have it one more time here at the end. And what the psalmist is doing is he's asking that God's favor would be shining again upon his people, because the psalmist knows, and this line I think is critical, the psalmist knows that true joy, the sort of deep, soul satisfying, sustaining joy, is found when the face of God is smiling upon his people, and when we delight in seeing and knowing the favor of God's smile. Um, that that is incomparable. In fact, that is better than grain and wine that abound. In other words, true joy is better than when a harvest is overflowing and when the vineyards are, rushing with grain and wine. That is joyful, but it doesn't compare to the kind of joy that the psalmist knows firsthand from when he sees the smile of God shining down upon him. And that then leads him to this concluding sentence, which is one I love. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you make me dwell in safety. By the way, there's a little connection there. You might have noticed that it's lying down and sleep, and that goes with ponder on your bed. So there's kind of that idea there. We touched on that a little bit earlier in our study, but it gets at this idea of the sort of rest and care that God provides for us. And the psalmist seems to be not vacillating, but the psalmist seems to be looking at some of the realities in his world, which are, honor being turned into shame and people loving vain words and seeking after lies. In other words, living amongst a people who seem to be pursuing superficial joy and even ridiculing those who are righteous. And so that's the reality that he lives in. But then there's the greater hope and the promise of living in right relationship with God, and that's a far better joy. So there we have kind of a breakdown of what this text, I think, is really all about. Now we've got some more work to do. We're going to take some time, and this is, of course, we can't do this on the video, but this gives you kind of a study of the text. But from here, where we go is we actually look at what is it, how can we dig deeper into all of this? Maybe we're going to look at some of the themes of God's graciousness and what does it mean when we find in other places the light of God's smile. The idea of honor and shame, we want to explore that a little bit further, and then we also want to make a connection to how does God's work and his promise in this text, how does it come to fulfillment through what Jesus does? And then from there we can go into making some points of application for our own lives. I hope you'll join me. We're going to be looking at this text on Sunday, March 2nd here at Sunnyslope, so I hope you'll join me when we have the chance to look at it then. Thanks for watching this segment of Digging In.